Good morning. I'm Sana, and you're listening to Let's Grab Coffee on WYXR 91.7 FM. Every Monday morning, I'm joined by experts from across the country who are investigating our most pressing social issues and common curiosities. Over the next hour, you'll learn about their inspirations, motivations, and of course, what they know about the world around us. So grab that cup of coffee and get ready for a fun and insightful conversation. According to the United Nations Convention of the Rights of the Child, everyone has the right to identity, the right to know one's history and origins, including children adopted transnationally out of a war. But how does one begin to know their history and origins? What links would you go to uncover the truths of your past? And how would you keep the hope of finding your family after separation by war, adoption, and immigration? These questions of identity, displacement, reunion, and care motivate the men, women, children, activists, and survivors in Dr. Elizabeth Barnert's book, Reunion: Finding the Disappeared Children of El Salvador. Dr. Elizabeth Barnert is a pediatrician and associate professor of pediatrics at the University of California, Los Angeles. Her research, grounded in human rights and social action, examines children affected by violence, family separation, and incarceration. Dr. Barnert has numerous publications in top-tier journals, including in Science, Pediatrics, and American Journal of Public Health. She has presented her work at the National Academies of Sciences, national and international research meetings, and through the mainstream news media, including via the Associated Press, National Public Radio, and PBS NewsHour. Dr. Barnert has advised the U.S. Congress and California Legislature, Governor, and Health and Human Services Agency on youth justice policy. She also serves on the board of the National Commission on Correctional Health Care and on the NCHC's Juvenile Health Committee and Structural Racism Committee. She also serves on the advisory board of Human Rights for Kids, a nonprofit dedicated to promoting children's rights in the United States. She co-leads the Reimagining Children's Rights Initiative, a national network to advance the child rights in the U.S., and the Youth Justice Node of the Life Course Intervention Research Network. Dr. Barnert is a founding board member of DNA Bridge, a nonprofit that seeks to promote a humanitarian approach to use of DNA for family reunification of children separated by war, disasters, or inhumane immigration policies. In Reunion: Finding the Disappeared Children of El Salvador, Dr. Barnert examines separation and reunification experiences of families torn apart in the 1980s Salvadoran Civil War, who later were reunited through a DNA bank she helped develop in partnership with the Salvadoran human rights organization Pro-Búsqueda. Reunion: Finding the Disappeared Children of El Salvador is available wherever you buy books. Good morning, Liz. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. It's an honor to be here.
It is an absolute honor of mine to have you here. I've read your amazing book, Reunion: Finding the Disappeared Children of El Salvador. And I'll be honest, I don't know what I expected when I started reading this book. I loosely knew what the book was about, but I had no clue what to expect in its pages. And I just have to say, the way that you have shared these stories of displacement, of these disappeared children, of reunion, and of war, is so compelling. I strongly hope that everyone reads your book because it's so important. You're able to talk about some very difficult realities, but to do so in a way that, like, I cried so many times. I cried so many times while reading the book, but it also made me want to get involved. And I think that's also very, very key. So I absolutely, thank you so much for all of your work. And we'll get more into the work that you've done. But thank you so much for writing this book so beautifully so that people who have no idea about the Salvadoran Civil War, for example, or about adoption, or about the process of reunification can understand it in, a very human to human way.
Thank you. The irony of it is you make it sound like what I did was very complicated, but it was actually very simple.
Mm-hmm.
I was a graduate student in El Salvador collecting DNA samples to build this DNA bank with Pro-Búsqueda, the organization that you mentioned. And people told me their stories. And like you're alluding to, their stories were so powerful. Mm-hmm. And so I was just writing them down. And as I was hearing them, not as I was hearing them, kind of, when I would get back to a computer, I would write them because they just seemed important. It was also how I myself was processing them. And that's what the book is. It's really just me editing my field notes from my time in El Salvador.
See, you make it sound like it was just so simple.
But it was.
But I think part of it is, like you said, people wanted to tell you their stories. I think that is a very human need for us to tell our stories, to have someone listen, and to make it into the historical record, which is also part of what this book is doing, as part of a much broader movement, right, to bring truth and awareness to what happened during the Civil War, but saying, like, we were here, we experienced this was very real, and these are the ramifications of, in this case, this Civil War that lasted over a decade, if I'm not mistaken, on the time frame. And I'm wondering, first, could you tell us a little bit, for our listeners, could you tell us a little bit about the Civil War itself? And that, I think, will help us understand a little bit more about these families and your work with the DNA Bank.
Sure. And to clarify, I'm a pediatrician, as you said. I'm not a Latin American studies expert. I'm somebody who is passionate about human rights and social justice. But my understanding of the war is that it occurred from 1980 to 1992. El Salvador had a lot of socioeconomic disparities that had really worsened, starting throughout colonialism. So indigenous families and indigenous identity kind of got wiped away. There was a huge massacre of indigenous people in 1932. El Salvador's history is very much connected with the United States and United States imperialism. So the massacre in 1932 was related to the Great Depression and the crash of coffee prices. And then what happened in El Salvador in the 1980s, it was really because of the US's fears around the Cold War and this concern that capitalism might take root in Central America. And so what happened was you had rural people in rural areas and also in urban areas that were just increasingly squeezed and really trying to advocate for basic rights, for a livable wage, not for luxury. And then people gradually began to organize. In 1980, the Archbishop of El Salvador at the time, Oscar Romero, who has since been decreed a saint by the Catholic Church, was assassinated while giving mass. He was begging soldiers not to kill in the name of the bloodshed of the military that was running the country at the time. And that was the moment that is marked in history as igniting the Civil War. And so the Civil War was between the Salvadoran military, which was heavily funded and trained by the United States, and then the FMLN, or Faribundo Martí Liberación Nacional, which was revolutionary forces. And one of the huge travesties of the war is really the civilians, the women, the children, the young men got caught in between, because anyone in the countryside who was living in an area where there was revolutionary activity was themselves labeled a rebel or a guerrilla sympathizer and was targeted for execution. Wow. And then the war finally ended in 1992, in part because the international community spoke out with some media attention about the grotesque human rights violations that were occurring.
Thank you so much for just that bit of context. I think it's important because, one, in the US, we have, this continual forgetting of what we have done around the world. And so I think that's important to note, and particularly because in the book, you're talking about these disappeared children. And so what's on the other side of that, we might think about transnational adoption, which is framed in a very humanitarian way. But I think it's important to understand why these quote unquote humanitarian efforts have to exist in the first place. And so I think that is really important context. I think it's also important to note that when we think about international adoption, it is very much has always been connected to U.S. militarism abroad. And so as a Korean adoptee, we can trace the histories of Korean adoption to Korean War to U.S. involvement as well. And so I really appreciate that in your book, you give us this grounding and you give us the opportunity to challenge our own beliefs about what we think about humanitarianism in the form of adoption, but also the U.S.'s own responsibility for what's happening around the globe. So thank you so much for giving us that context for our conversation today.
Absolutely. I think it's really the starting point for, I don't want to use that term that our former president used, but for understanding why families might feel the need to immigrate, might feel the need to separate, or why families were torn apart for these, as you said, humanitarian adoptions.
Absolutely. Now, you talk about, of course, the focus is on these disappeared children in the wake of the Civil War. And I thought it was so sad, when reading your book about how the government refuses to even acknowledge that these children have been disappeared. And I think in the book, you talk about an estimated 10,000 children that, refusal of the Salvadoran government to even acknowledge that this happened and that these disappeared children do exist somewhere, right? And so 10,000 children, and I know with the organization that you're working with, of course, the goal is to help reunite these families. Could you talk a little bit about your work? And I know it started just as a graduate student, just doing something simple as collecting DNA, but could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So Pro-Búsqueda, like you said, it's the mission is to find the disappeared children and to give young people the opportunity to reunite. So I want to make sure that we talk about that aspect of the young people's agency in that. But the organization was founded by a Jesuit priest, Father John Cortina, who was actually a mentee of St. Oscar Romero, and by mothers of the disappeared children who had watched their children taken away by the military during the war. And so they, for many years, were working to find the children. And then I became involved through UC Berkeley Human Rights Center and through Physicians for Human Rights to build a DNA bank to reunify the families, both through verification of identifications that had been made by tracing adoption records and gathering witness testimonies, and also by just putting everything together in a database and seeing what matches can be made. So one of the most beautiful moments for me of writing this book, because I'm writing about work I did 15 years ago. If you look at the back cover of the book, there's a man, he's about 30 something years old, and he's hugging a mother. And this photo was sent to me as I was finishing the book, actually the day that I was about to submit the photos. And they're like, here's a good one. I was like, wait, this is a great picture. And now I have to redo the photo count. But it's a picture of a young man who grew up in Australia and was reunited with his biological mother through a cold hit match in the DNA bank. That means that there were no leads about where he was. And without the DNA bank, they never would have been had the opportunity to meet again. So that's what we were doing. And as you said, the other part of Pro-Búsqueda's work is they call it the memoria viva, the living memory, or this kind of historical accountability, the celebration and supporting of the survivors, and doing what they can to bring courts to the cases to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, or to bring justice really to the human rights violations of the war.
Yes. I think it is so great that the mothers, right, of these disappeared children, with the help, right, of the church, were able to start this whole movement. I was recently talking with a girlfriend of mine, and she was like, well, why isn't there just like a DNA kind of like ancestry.com, right, for Korean adoptees, right? Because I am a Korean adoptee. And she was like, how can you find your family? Or what if you have siblings? Like, why isn't there just DNA, some sort of organized DNA database? And that is what you all were able to do. And I think it just shows the power of family and of keeping hope, right? And keeping that hope for many years in wanting to find their children and find other family members. And that even gives me a lot of hope as well as an international adoptee. And one of the quotes that really stuck out to me from your book is this quote that says, "They persevere in a battle of hope." And you've really shown that through the pages of your book, so much hope, but also a lot of desperation sometimes, and disappointment and sadness as well. But I love that piece that you said about giving disappeared children, or giving these adopted children the agency to decide, how do I want to pursue this relationship, if I want to pursue a relationship, and then how do I want to move forward. And I also found that in the book, I loved how you had all of these different stories and voices, both of the family members in El Salvador, but also the disappeared children, in really tracing the different reactions to knowing that you have family. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the different kind of themes among the disappeared children, but also the families that you encountered.
Yeah, so that's a really great question. And I suspect that there's a lot of universality to what I observed in El Salvador, to children who are adopted in from other countries and in other circumstances. So, and I think it relates to the fundamental nature of the parent-child bond. So the themes, the separation was incredibly difficult and painful, and the children were surviving in war. The families were just surviving in war. And I think this is best understood through the concept of ambiguous loss, the intense pain of the uncertainty of not knowing if your loved one is alive or dead, and if you are ever going to see them again. And so that is also part of the battle of hope, that mothers feel like they can't grieve, because if they grieve, they're giving up hope. But then if they grieve, which can be a healthy thing to do, they're blocked from that healing process. And so that is really the role of DNA, or of an organization like Pro-Búsqueda, is to have that moment where there's that identification, then that restores choice. Like as Father John said, the mission of Pro-Búsqueda is to give the young children the opportunity to reunite. And I believe what I saw is that that's really when the healing begins. Then, as you're saying, people responded in different ways, and it was all very understandable. I think another main theme is that reunion. Wow, that is an intense event. They are so joyful. It's such a privilege to be at a reunion. I'm getting tingles all over my body. Like I not even a wedding. I don't think I've ever been part of a more powerful moment. And I've, been at many births and delivered 2 babies. But that moment of coming together, the mother-child embrace, and it tends to play out in a very similar way. And the moment of reunion also rebirths the trauma of the separation. So it's a beautiful moment, but it's also a very painful moment. And so what comes after that, something I learned, is that families absolutely deserve and need support in what is probably a lifelong process of reintegration. How are these new relationships going to work together? So this is very relevant when we think about all of the migrant children at our border, and the children that the Trump administration tore apart, and the efforts of the Biden administration Family Reunification Task Force. What does it mean to support families in reunification? And that is another aspect of what Pro-Búsqueda does, and I learned a lot from them. They have a psychologist on site. They go into the countryside, and they just give free support to the families and do workshops to help people heal. And like you said, people respond differently. So I kind of think about that concept as that reunification operates on a continuum. So for some people, just knowing that other person survived and they have the choice is enough. With transnational adoption, it gets very complicated, not just because you have a cultural difference and a language difference, but half of people in El Salvador live in poverty. And so those dynamics are quite challenging for transnational adoptees, particularly for ones who are in developed or more affluent countries, which is where most of them, like Angela, were. And other people will actually choose to have an in-person reunion like Angela did. And very, very few actually relocated to to actually be in the same household or to be near their biological parent. So we see a range of responses. It all makes a lot of sense. It relates to the trauma of separation and the healing that can begin when that ambiguous loss is resolved. The other thing I wanted to say when you were mentioning the young people that were adopted out of Korea and that there's not a DNA bank, that is something that can be done. It's a great idea. It's very doable. And you're absolutely right. It's because of the heroes at Pro-Búsqueda that this work happened in El Salvador. One of the aspects of my work that continues on now is that we founded a nonprofit based in the United States called DNA Bridge. And the role of DNA Bridge is to promote the humanitarian use of DNA. So through my work with Pro-Búsqueda, I've come to understand that importance of allowing the opportunity for reunion and the way that DNA can be used safely, securely, and in a way that is trauma informed and supports people's rights. And so I've come to understand that we have the technological means. It's actually cheap and easy to run a DNA test. There's rapid DNA machines that are the size of a printer nowadays. We live in a world where there never again needs to be a lost child. So we don't need to have children needlessly separated because they don't know where their parents are. However, there's a lot that needs to be kind of worked out to use DNA with the proper safeguards. So yes, this can be done for prior separations in Korea, but one of the things that we DNA Bridge is talking about are the new separations that are happening in the Ukraine, and this concern about it being a tactic of war that Russia is removing children from Ukraine and putting them in Russia. We're not seeing much media attention on this. There was a New York Times article published on it, but these same patterns are repeating. And this historical moment in El Salvador is so important because it relates so much to these issues that we see with immigration, with gang violence, and as you said, with U.S. imperialism that hasn't stopped. And in many respects, it's actually worsened. And I don't want to make people upset, but if you look at the trajectory, it's likely that separations will increase. As climate change worsens and there's more political strife and resource scarcity. So we can solve these. I think human rights is a very important tool. I think DNA is a very important tool. I think media and what you're doing and speaking out is a very important tool. But the lessons that I learned from the disappeared children in El Salvador are very relevant to today. In fact, I would have loved to have not written this book because it was hard. And as we were saying before you hit the record button, I cried many times, but it transmits a power and a resilience that is so important. But there is resounding lessons that I really hope people learn because I think we need to use them to inform our present day and our future.
Yes, so many lessons, because unfortunately history continues to repeat itself over and over and over and over again. Let's take a quick break. You're listening to Let's Grab Coffee on WYXR 91.7 FM. I'm Sana, and you're here on WYXR 91.7 FM. This is Let's Grab Coffee, and I'm joined today by Elizabeth Barnert, the author of Reunion, Finding the Disappeared Children of El Salvador. And before the break, Liz, you were giving us just this great overview of all of the connections of your book to present day, unfortunately, present day continued experiences of forced displacement, forced separation, and also how different countries are really, unfortunately leveraging separation of children and families in order to advance, in many cases, very harmful political agendas. And one thing that I really appreciated about your book was really laying out, okay, these were the actions taken by the government, both in El Salvador, but also the U.S. government that really facilitated all of these atrocities. And the other piece that I really appreciated was, as you're explaining before the break, was how just a small group of very dedicated human beings were able to come together and create this organization that has led to the reunion, or at least the matching of close to 500 families. And so that is definitely a cause for hope, but also I think a model for unfortunately, many other countries where we do see the separation of children and families.
Absolutely. My colleagues at Pro-Búsqueda, they are amazing. And some of them are still there. And
Mhm.
I'm glad that I had field notes, but I could still call them up, as recently as 3 months ago, doing final proofs of the book. Hey, do you remember this case? Oh yeah. Da, 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 da. And they remember everything. They're so dedicated.
Mhm.
Many of them are the relatives of the disappeared or the disappeared children themselves. And so this for them, they're fighting for their family and for their own identity. But
Mhm.
absolutely, Pro-Búsqueda gives so much hope. I'm honored to have gotten the chance to work so closely with them.
Mhm. And I mean, all of these stories, the way that you're able to weave these stories together, they are definitely, seared in my mind as well. So I could only imagine for folks who are on the ground, right, interviewing people, taking those DNA samples, how much more they remember, both all the times when people are able to reunite, but also the times that people, that they can't or they don't want to, as you mentioned. The great thing about the work with Pro-Búsqueda is that, again, that option, that opportunity to reconnect, but also I think just the peace and the resolution in some sense of knowing that your family is alive and well, or even if they're no longer here, still some sense of knowing, which I think is a great gift to have as well.
Absolutely. I completely agree.
Yes. Now, something that I thought was interesting that you kind of touched on before the break was talking about the humanitarian use of DNA, and what came up in the book was folks' hesitancy, right, for many very well-founded reasons, hesitancy for giving their DNA, even though they very much wanted to, try to find their relatives. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the ways that we can use DNA in a more ethical way, in a humanitarian way, and also maybe even some of the reasons why folks who were very hesitant ultimately decided, like, okay, I will give this DNA sample.
Sure. So I think that the barriers to the DNA that I talk about in Reunion, they really had to do with some of it was cultural, and it
Hmm.
was really about trust. One of the barriers that we heard was the elderly relatives were afraid that the collection of the DNA sample, which was a little, basically like a cotton swab that we'd scrape on the inside of their cheek, would cause their teeth to fall out, which was founded.
Hmm.
I mean, is a reasonable concern. So I think that families had also, as I said, were stuck in the middle during this war, right? And
Hmm.
so it was at risk of death to
Hmm.
side with the system, both sides. It was
Right.
dangerous, even though in many instances the FMLN was protecting the civilians. So there was fear and mistrust, and it was really through the reputation of Pro-Búsqueda that families were able to give their DNA sample. And once they understood that it would either help them find their missing relative, or maybe help in a judicial process, then families felt like giving the sample. What was interesting also were the reflections for people who had already been matched and were very
Hmm.
confident in their match. So one of them was the daughter of the founder. So the daughter is Elsie in the book, and she
Hmm.
was talked about that she was having political conflicts with her mother. She
Right.
had grown up in an orphanage and then got married as a way to get out of the orphanage, and had her in-laws were very conservative, and her mother was very much on the other political side. And she said, but once I got that DNA result, DNA doesn't lie.
Hmm.
So there were barriers, but the DNA also helped people build trust. I
Hmm.
think the type of barriers that we talk about on a macro level. So when we're talking about the humanitarian use of DNA now, the DNA bridge, what the academics, we've talked to the Biden administration, we've talked to the United Nations, and people are afraid of data security. There's
Hmm.
fears that, for example, if DNA is used in the context of migration, that the government could subpoena the DNA data, and that could lead to deportation. And
Hmm.
so some of the barriers, the mistrust around DNA really just involves education and helping people understand, for example, that the DNA, the segments of the DNA that are used for identification purposes don't give information like, does this person have asthma or anything that could be, play along the lines of eugenics. However, these other barriers of concern for confidentiality of the data are very important. And so there is a way to overcome it, but you have to do it carefully. So we published an article in Science that proposed a framework for using DNA to support a reunification of the migrant families that were separated by the Trump administration. And it involves the use of the involvement of a third party, such as the International Commissions of Missing Persons, which is an intergovernmental organization. So it has treaty level protections that would protect the security of the DNA. So there's ways to do it. And we've come to the conclusion that it's actually a human rights violation to not do it, because you're violating people's right to identity if you don't avail of that opportunity to reconnect them. But you do have to do it with the proper safeguards, using these treaty level protections with lawyers, et cetera, to figure it out. But politically, the government should not be afraid of it, but the government also should not control the DNA database. The other key is to use a database strategy. So you're not doing one-to-one testing, but like Pro-Búsqueda, you have a DNA bank that has everyone's data and their identities are separate from the DNA profiles. So it's doable.
Yes. Yeah. No, thank you so much for that, because I think, for all of us, we probably have some hesitancy around just handing our DNA over, even if we think that it can help lead to, some great outcomes and some beneficial outcomes. I think there is kind of a healthy level of hesitancy around like, okay, wait a minute, what is my information actually going to be used for? So thank you so much for even giving us that kind of overview of how this might work, and also of understanding the safeguards that are in place. Because even, in the context of your work in Reunion in your book, you write so eloquently about the hesitancies that people feel, and kind of that push and pull of like, yes, I do want to potentially find my family members, but also I'm very concerned, for my health, or for even my spiritual well-being, or, just these other instances of like, wait a minute, what am I really doing here? So thank you so much for that. I think the other thing that really stood out for me in your book is how you really were able to show us the various ways that the disappeared children were feeling about potentially reuniting. So maybe they have a match, and that, that's one step, and that feels very healing on many levels. But then trying to decide, okay, do I want to actually reconnect with people who maybe I still have very vivid memories of, or I have some, some sense of anger, right? Or even disappointment or confusion around, but even questioning, what does this mean for me to have, multiple families as well? And so I really appreciated you giving us a range of folks' reactions, and a range of even kind of what happened post reunion as well, because I think we often don't understand that it's not simply, oh, you found some family and yay, everyone lives happily ever after, but there are a lot of different outcomes that happen, throughout the years as well.
Yeah, and absolutely. And the role of the adoptive family is very important. So some adoptive families were fearful
Mm-hmm.
and they didn't want to support the reunification process. Other adoptive families like Angela, who's portrayed in the book, were incredibly supported. As
Mm-hmm.
her father is quoted, "No one can ever have too much love," which is one
Yes.
of the most beautiful things I've ever heard. And I really admire that Angela shared her story and invited PBS NewsHour to come with
Mm-hmm.
us on her family reunion. And I think it's because Angela intuitively and intellectually knew that she was coming from a very supportive adoptive
Mm-hmm.
family, and she's also a very strong and generous person. And so she wanted to offer the support that she had to other people who might be experiencing that range of emotions, but having less support.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I was so moved by Angela's father's words as well, particularly in the context in which he offers up, offers up, there we go, this quote, because I think, for different journalists, and you talk about some of the journalists' questions, often insensitive or just relying upon some stereotypes and tropes around family, particularly adoptive family or biological family. And so for her father to say that, that really warmed my heart. Particularly as an adoptee as well, who, experiences many of the feelings that are portrayed in your book, and to have her dad, give her that support, just really, really warmed my heart, because it's not always, as you mentioned, there's not always support. And in fact, some of the people, that you have vignettes of in the book, their adoptive family, are very much opposed to meeting, and having, the children meet as well.
Yeah, so it's like we said, it operates on a continuum, and it's on the one hand, it's very universal, and I think essential to kind of human nature, and on the other hand, it is nuanced and complex.
Mhm. And just the way that you've really drawn out all those complexities and nuances, that's something I really loved about the book, right? I think a really good book gives you the opportunity to question what you know and question what you believe, but also help you feel something. And your book does all of this so beautifully. The other piece that really stood out to me as I was reading this, just that reminder that adoption is not this straightforward process of, you have, benevolent people on throughout the entire process that are completely operating, with the best intentions. Because as you talk about in the book, in so many of these instances, you have deception, you have, manipulation, you have, biological families thinking that they're making the best decision, for their children, or that their children will be returned to them. And this is what they're being told, in certain cases by lawyers, and all of that is false. And, how are they to know? Right. And then also just thinking on the other end, oftentimes how are adoptive parents supposed to know, right? They're thinking they're going through this legal process. And so I appreciated you even including those details, because I think it's important for us, to know that, to question, right, some of these policies and practices. But I think it's also helpful as we think about so many of the humanitarian crises that are happening around the country, and that international adoption will most likely be, offered up as a quote unquote solution. I think it's important for us to really interrogate that.
Absolutely. And in the process of reflecting on the history, I would try to imagine kind of 1980 when I was 1 year old. So what information was the US being
Mhm.
receiving? So you would have an occasional article by the New York Times, Washington Post. You have your ambassador on the ground who would take the airplane. Information is getting transmitted to Congress by faxes. I think that there was a tremendous ability to control
Mhm.
the messaging around this, and I wonder how that translates today, where we both have a completely different media environment, but also there are repressive regimes that can still be controlling the messaging around this. I think that but as you started, I do believe that every child has the right to identity, and what I've
Mhm.
come to understand is that that is a very important aspect of health. And it was not me who recognized this. It was Pro-Búsqueda. Pro-Búsqueda
Mhm.
said, we are here, we are fighting so that children can have the opportunity to reunite because of their right to identity.
Mhm. Yes, and in the book, you talk about, it's particularly in Angela's case, right? Because you've kind of followed her journey, very in depth. These questions of identity, right? These questions of family, these questions of, who am I? Where do I belong? And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that identity piece, particularly for the disappeared children who were reunited, and maybe some of the ways that they're thinking about themselves differently.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I do feel, I have a limited ability to answer that because identity is so personal. I
Mhm.
did do 50 research interviews with families of young people who grew up in El Salvador. So they were not adopted transnationally. They grew up in orphanages or in informal adoptions in El Salvador. And a couple of them, the change of reunion and feeling like they belong to a family actually gave them that sense of self-love and social connection that they left gangs. And that is very, very important. And I think it's a much under discussed reason why we're seeing so much gang violence and so many young people in gangs. I think for the transnational adoptees, for Angela, I think I just saw her. We had a book launch event 2 weeks ago. I think that her own sense of identity is still evolving, and she's sharing it with her daughter as they're cherishing their roots in El Salvador, but also kind of in a healthy way setting boundaries around their life and their family in the United States. So it's very complicated. I think for the transnational adoptees, just like on a sociological level, it's so important for us to reckon with the history of what happened with the Salvadoran Civil War. For them, this is their personal history. One of the things, I had a Mexican-American first-generation research assistant who helped me when we were analyzing the interviews, and she pulled out this phrase, sangre llama sangre, blood calls blood. And we just kept hearing that over and over again. There is something about knowing for people, it seems. I mean, I'm not an expert in adoption literature and adoption, but knowing your biological family is out there and to know your roots and your own personal story seems to be very important. Culturally, spiritually, El Salvador and the Salvadoran people is a very wealthy nation, yet very impoverished. And so that it makes this tragic, jolting disconnect as young people are reunited, and put me as this Cuban American gringa in the middle of actually translating during reunions. I think something else that's also relevant is the age of the separation. So some people were separated as babies. So the only identity they consciously knew, even though a lot of imprinting probably does happen in the womb and in those first days, but the only identity they were aware of was their US or French identity. Others, there's somebody portrayed in Reunion who separated at age 7, and she said, I remember everything. So I mean, I read a child development textbook. I read Erik Erikson's theories on identity formation before I went there. I don't have the answers, but what I can tell you as a pediatrician is that this is a very, very important part of children's health and development. And it really has implications. You could see it in their parenting, and it likely has implications for their entire lives.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for that. Well, we're going to take another quick break. I'm Sana, and you're listening to Let's Grab Coffee on WYXR 91.7 FM. This is Let's Grab Coffee on WYXR 91.7 FM. I'm Sana, and we're here this morning with Dr. Elizabeth Barnert, the author of Reunion, Finding the Disappeared Children of El Salvador. Now, Liz, of course, when you were working with Pro-Búsqueda, that was, over a decade ago. And I'm wondering if you could give us some information on what Pro-Búsqueda is doing now, and even ways that maybe if you're still involved or ways that we could get involved.
Sure. So Pro-Búsqueda is still looking for the disappeared children. They were disappeared in the early 80s, so they're about my age. And they're still facilitating reunion. So you mentioned the numbers that to date, Pro-Búsqueda has reconnected 463 kids, but 570 cases remain unresolved. And the parent generation, they're aging. And so right now, UC Berkeley Human Rights Center is working with Pro-Búsqueda on a push to get more DNA samples from mothers. In particular, they're saying that that is a gap that is in the database. One of the most inspiring parts of working with Pro-Búsqueda is that we did come from the north to the south to help build the DNA bank, but then Pro-Búsqueda now actually runs the DNA bank on their own. So it's still going. There's if you are listening and you feel like that you might be connected to this, that you were adopted from El Salvador in the 1980s, I encourage you to contact the UC Berkeley Human Rights Center. You can email me. My address is online through the UCLA website, or you can contact Pro-Búsqueda directly. There's no charge, and you will have complete choice in the matter. So that is the core part of what Pro-Búsqueda is doing, but they're still organizing, they're still pushing human rights cases. They have they have a very active Facebook page. They're doing workshops for the families to keep the historical memory alive.
Mm-hmm. One thing that really moved me about Pro-Búsqueda is that there was a psychologist, as part of the organization. So someone who could offer that ongoing support. And I really appreciated that, knowing the intentionality around Pro-Búsqueda having, this range of folks in their organization, because that process of reunion, it doesn't just end when you meet somebody, right? There's still all of these different, feelings and emotions and thoughts that you need to process. So that really heartened me to know the extensiveness of what was being offered through the organization.
Yeah, and we had a book launch event in Los Angeles 2 weeks ago, and Angela came to it. It was wonderful to sit next to her. And one of the things she said to the audience was, Pro-Búsqueda has become my family. So when she goes to El Salvador, that's where she also does connect with her biological family there still, but they are still supporting people. It's a network that extends through El Salvador and internationally.
Oh, that's so wonderful to hear. Now, I know you in the book with giving us some insights and connections to, what you have learned here in the El Salvadoran case, and you kind of alluded to it a little bit as we were talking earlier, but also what you've learned through your work with Pro-Búsqueda. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about that because, as you mentioned, of course, here in the U.S., we have experienced border separation, or we have enforced border separation. And I can remember distinctly when that policy went into practice. And my first thoughts, of course, were, okay, what is going to happen to these children? These are going to be children who are going to be, adopted into U.S. families, as if this was the only option, which it wasn't. And how will these children be supported? And even you mentioned, of course, now in Ukraine and thinking about, children being forcibly separated. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about some of the ways that we can take what we know and actually do something differently, both here in the U.S., but even thinking, around the globe as well.
Absolutely. So I think the two most important implications of this work, it's very simple, but it is really important to prevent separations whenever possible.
Mm-hmm.
And that needs to be done with the best interests of the child. So if a child is unsafe in their home, or if the child is unsafe in their home country, no, we don't want to block the separation. But on a structural level, Pro-Búsqueda is an outlier, but we need to create the conditions where families can stay together and families can be healthy in being together. So that really needs to be the guiding principle in our policy making, in the programs, and how we support families on the ground. And then I think the other aspect is what Pro-Búsqueda learned so beautifully, because they were composed of the families themselves, is as everyone's listening, I'm sure it's now become clear, is that people need support with reunification. I had a big kind of wake up moment in 2018, when the Trump administration was forcibly separating families. The media started reaching out to me because there was such little literature on the long-term impacts of separation and reunification on children's health and well-being. And I got contacted to speak on, it seemed like they were sort of a right-wing media source, and there was a video of a reunion between a mother from Central America and her biological son, who looked like he was about preschool age. And the angle that they wanted me to comment on was, can you tell us that this reunion isn't real? Because you don't see the child running into his mother's arms as one might expect. And I did not take them up on that. I did not talk to them, but that really alarmed me that kind of request was out there. And so I think what's most important is that we understand this, how reunion that moment of re-meeting, how there's those range of responses, and how reunification happens on a continuum, and that it's so key to give families, this is where the book starts with Father John asserting the mission, the opportunity for reunion, be that through DNA, be that through proper tracking of them, if we're going to tear families apart, etc. And then that we support families through the reunification process. And as you were saying, family can mean a lot of things. I think this concept of transnational families is very important too. And family does not necessarily mean biological child, biological mother, biological father. So we need to support families in reunification. We need to prevent families from being torn apart.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for that. And also for that reminder that family looks a lot of different ways. And I think that's something else that really comes through in the book. There, of course, family by blood, and then family who raised you, or family by love, and then family of the people who are fighting for something, together, which I see very much portrayed in the folks involved in Pro-Búsqueda, in the folks who've been working for years and years, right, to help reunite and help find and make those matches. And I see those as types of family, which reminds me, even in the book, there are a lot of different opinions about what family is, and the importance of, as you mentioned, blood calls blood, right? And that really intrigued me as well. Some of the different comments from folks around how they were thinking about family, and what types of family they were looking for and hoping to create. And so I'm wondering for you, how has your work changed or expanded your own ideas of family?
Oh, that's a very good question. I think I'm still working on reintegrating, to use that term from the reunification literature, what I learned in El Salvador with my frontline clinical practice. So my clinical work is at juvenile hall. I have seen kids who crossed the border from El Salvador as an unaccompanied minor, and it's hard to put together, like having such a deep knowledge of the history and the reunification process. I also, UCLA was providing care in the emergency shelters, I think 2 summers ago, when there was this huge overflow. And so we were seeing many, I mean, everybody there was a young adult who was an unaccompanied minor, and every single one of them was like, oh gosh, I wish I could tell everybody and tell you what I understand about what you're going through in your home country. I don't know. I think what you're really pointing to is the gap, is how do we take this deep knowledge of family, this deep knowledge of the forces that drive separation, this deep knowledge of what humans are going through. And that's what I'm actually pushing myself to work on, is how can I operationalize what I've learned from El Salvador to apply it, to the Korean War, or in advance to the children in Ukraine. And so their separations are never happen, or as short as possible. In terms of my own concept of family, I don't really have a clear answer. All I can say is I love your term, families by love. I think that is brilliant.
Well, thank you so much, Liz. I cannot say, enough good things about this book. Absolutely beautifully written, about a very difficult topic, but something that is very real and that we have to face in order to understand and in order to make some changes in the best interest of family. So thank you so much. And thank you so much for spending time with us this morning.
You're welcome. It's my honor.
Thank you again to Dr. Elizabeth Barnert, the author of Reunion, Finding the Disappeared Children of El Salvador. Of course, as you could tell, I absolutely loved this book. Yes, it talks about a very difficult topic, talking about the Civil War in El Salvador that led to the separation of thousands of children and families, but it does so in a way that really gives you an understanding of the many different policies and practices that led to both the Civil War, also led to the adoption out of many of these children, but also, most importantly, gives you this great overview of Pro-Búsqueda and all of the great work that they are doing in order to reunite children and families, or at least give children and families the opportunity to reunite. Well, for today's positive note, I actually want to leave you with a quote that's from the foreword of this book that says, "Not telling a truth because it is too uncomfortable is not responsible." And when I read that quote in the foreword of Reunion, it really captured me because there's so many difficult truths, uncomfortable truths, embarrassing truths that we have to confront and that we have to give voice to in order for us to move forward and to create a more just future for us all. Not telling a truth because it is too uncomfortable is not responsible. The positive part of this quote is that we are able to take responsibility and to have the courage to tell a truth. And I think that is what Dr. Elizabeth Barnert has done in her beautifully written book, Reunion: Finding the Disappeared Children of El Salvador. Well, this has been Let's Grab Coffee on WYXR 91.7 FM. In case you missed any part of this conversation, don't worry. You can listen to the replay on WYXR.org on Let's Grab Coffee show page, or you can subscribe to Let's Grab Coffee in podcast format wherever you stream podcasts. That way you can listen to this episode again. You can also send it to a friend. I can't wait for you to be back here with me next Monday morning.